On this day in history, November 28th, 1717, the pirate Blackbeard captures a French merchant slave ship, and it becomes his most famous ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge. Captain Blackbeard went by the name Edward Teach, or Thatch, depending on the spelling. However, pirates often went by a fake last name to protect the family name, so it's unlikely that Teach was his real last name. He was an English pirate and operated in the Caribbean. Although not a lot is known about his early life, he could read and write very well, so it's likely that he came from a wealthy family. So from 1702 to 1713, there had been a war called Queen Anne's War. It was the second in a series of French and Indian wars that was fought in North America between Great Britain, France, and Spain. During this time, many private sailors became privateers, which is basically just acting as a pirate, but with permission. So when the war ended, a lot of these guys who had been privateers and been getting pretty good at it, they didn't want to return to their old lives or their old jobs, so they just turned to piracy instead. Around 1716, Blackbeard became a member of the crew on renowned Captain Benjamin Hornigold's ship. So these pirate ships weren't capturing ships full of gold and treasure like you might think. Usually when they took over a ship that was full of cargo like flour, sugar, cocoa, and wine. Madeira wine. Pirates loved Madeira wine. In fact, there was this one time where they took over a ship and they left the rest of the cargo on board and they only took the wine. So Captain Hornigold had a beef with some of the other, merchant ships, and he became more interested in settling his personal scores than actual piracy, and it was really bumming his crew out, so eventually he stepped down as captain and Captain Blackbeard was born. And now a word from our sponsors. Blackbeard was a shrewd and calculating leader who actually despised the use of violence and instead relied on some wicked good PR and his bad boy image. He was reported to be tall, wore big boots, dark clothing, and often a colorful velvet coat. His long black beard was often tied in braids, sometimes with colored ribbons in the end. He was a real razz-dazzler. He covered himself in pistols and actually tied lit fuses, or slow matches, to his hat so that smoke billowed behind him as he walked to frighten his enemies. This guy must have really been a sight to see. So on November 28th, 1717, Blackbeard and his two ships flanked a French merchant ship carrying a cargo full of slaves, killing many of its crew and forcing its captain to surrender. He took the ship and renamed her Queen Anne's Revenge and equipped her with 40 guns. Blackbeard sailed from the Bahamas to Florida, capturing ships and recruiting their crew. He must have made one hell of a sales pitch. By May of 1718, he had promoted himself to Commodore and was probably in charge of around 300 to 400 pirates. Now, they weren't all on one ship, if that's what you were thinking. That's what I was thinking. But apparently, he would add the ships that he'd capture to his fleet. And so he had many different ships, all sailing together, I suppose. Around this time, he teamed up with a gentleman pirate named Stede Bonnet, who was a wealthy landowner who left his family behind and turned to a life of piracy. At one point, they had completely blockaded Charlestown, or Charleston, South Carolina, preventing any ships from coming in or out of the harbor without, I assume, taking what they wanted first. One ship, headed towards London with a group of prominent citizens, were robbed and locked below deck for about half a day. Blackbeard held them as hostages, demanding a ransom of medical supplies, because apparently being a pirate out there was pretty rough. Not good for the health. So Blackbeard demanded medical supplies from the governor of South Carolina to take care of his seamen, stating that he would execute the prisoners if he didn't get it. So one hostage, a Mr. Marks, is escorted back into Charlestown with two pirate escorts to collect the medicine. Once the drugs are secured, Mr. Marks is ready to head back to the ship, but his two pirate escorts were nowhere to be found. Because, they were off somewhere drunk. So Captain Blackbeard, who had given this quest just 2 days to return, when they hadn't returned, brought all 8 pirate ships into the harbor. and really riled up the people of Charleston. Eventually, Marks and the pirates return to the ship, medicine in hand. Blackbeard keeps his end of the bargain, releases the hostages, takes the medicine, and goes. So spoiler alert, the Queen Anne's Revenge does end up sinking, and it was excavated in, I don't know, the 70s or the 90s or something, and they found these utensils that were full of mercury, and they were long and probish, and they were meant to be shoved up someone's thing to treat syphilis. So there was that going on for them. Tough. It looked, I mean, they didn't put like a little quarter down to reference the size, but the apparati, it seemed thick. Ugh. So anyway, Blackbeard releases the hostages, takes their money first, sends them on their way. Just a little light robbing. So news of a king's pardon had reached the Americas, and apparently this was fairly common with privateers turned pirates. You see, the government, the king, had a great use for privateers during times of war because they'd basically attack all the enemies and loot their ships. They were doing the king's work for them. But then when the war ended and these guys turned to piracy, well, that was to be expected. It was kind of a nuisance. But when war came along again and the king needed these guys, he would just issue a pardon and voila, they'd be back to work as privateers. And it was this real fun cat and mouse game that they played for, I don't know, a decade or so. So Blackbeard and his crew are off the coast of North Carolina when news of the latest king's pardon reaches their little pirate ears. This pardon was available to all pirates as long as they accepted before September 5th, 1718, and Blackbeard and Bonnet were interested in accepting. However, Blackbeard didn't exactly trust the pardon, and maybe that issue with Charleston would have made them ineligible. So, wanting to know exactly what the consequences would be, he convinced Bonnet to go first. He said, just you go on ahead, you take the pardon, and we'll just see what happens. I can't imagine he worded it that way. Apparently he was a very persuasive guy. But he eventually convinces Bonnet to go ashore and accept the pardon and see what happens. He was kind of like his little guinea pig, which is not a great way to treat your friend. Bonnet was pardoned, I believe under the condition that he would go back and retrieve Blackbeard and bring him ashore as well. But when he went back to where Blackbeard said he would be waiting with the ships, the ship was looted, and Blackbeard was nowhere to be found. What a guy. For the next several months, Bonnet would chase Blackbeard up the East Coast, Blackbeard leaving a trail of marooned sailors in his wake, which Bonnet would rescue, kind of like a weird lover's trail of rose petals. Eventually, in June of 1718, Blackbeard accepted his pardon and settled down in North Carolina, shacking up right next to the governor, Governor Charles Eden. This guy, I don't know, must have been really smitten with Blackbeard because for the next several months, he just kind of let Blackbeard do whatever he wanted and let him get away with all of it. Blackbeard even supposedly married one of Charles Eden's homeboy's daughters. So they were getting all buddy-buddy, and Governor Eden allowed Blackbeard to continue to work under him as a privateer, and I really wonder, was Blackbeard working for Charles Eden, or was he just doing his own pirate thing and he had Eden so badly under his thumb that the dude would just pardon whatever? Blackbeard didn't really seem to appreciate authority or being told when and where to be a pirate, and so shortly after this arrangement, he resumed a life of piracy. So while Blackbeard and the governor of North Carolina were all kissy-kissy, the governor of Pennsylvania, South Carolina, and Virginia were not having it. And the governor of Pennsylvania issued a warrant for Blackbeard's arrest. During this time, Blackbeard had traded his ship Queen Anne's Revenge for another ship called Adventure. He didn't really trade it so much as I think he intentionally grounded Queen Anne's Revenge. For some reason, they're always taking ships and then grounding them, taking them and then disposing of them. I don't know why. Who am I to explain the mind of a pirate? He was spending a lot of time at Ocracoke Inlet in the Outer Banks of North Carolina. It was his favorite spot because of the perfect vantage point to watch ships traveling from the various settlements in the Carolinas. And it was there that he first noticed the approaching ship of another fellow pirate, Charles Vane. So Charles Vane was another notorious pirate who rose quickly to the top. And unlike Blackbeard, he was known to be very violent and cruel. So anyway, Blackbeard and Vane spent several nights at the southern tip of Ocracoke Island just living it up with other notorious pirates, such as Calico Jack. What a party that must have been. The governors of Virginia and Pennsylvania were pretty peeved about the pirate party and at North Carolina for doing nothing about it. They issued a proclamation demanding that all former pirates make themselves known to authorities, give up their arms, and not travel in groups larger than 3. These guys were just pissing themselves trying to figure out where Blackbeard was, arresting without cause former crewmates of his in hopes to learn about his whereabouts. The fact that they believed that Blackbeard might have a mountain of treasure hidden away may have also been a compelling reason to want to bring him in. So the governors of Pennsylvania and Virginia put a bounty on Blackbeard's head over and above what King George would pay. Remember, America was still under British authority at the time. British royal officer Lieutenant Robert Maynard took 2 ships, sent one by sea from Virginia, and he himself took the other and sailed down the Pamlico River, intending to trap Blackbeard on the coast of North Carolina. Coming to the end of the Pamlico River, Lieutenant Maynard sent a scout ahead into the channel, where they noticed Blackbeard's crew anchored to the inner side of Ocracoke Island, just living it up. At this point, Blackbeard had reduced his crew from about 300 to 400 pirates down to about 50. Having a pirate crew that large was becoming more of a liability. So on the morning of November 22nd, Lieutenant Maynard, took this tiny little ship who was out in the channel taking soundings, which is where you drop a rope with, I don't know, like a rock at the bottom, and you're taking measurements of the depths of the seafloor. This tiny little ship just minding its own business, taking readings of the seafloor. Lieutenant Maynard takes this guy and he said, okay, what you're going to do is you're going to go out into the channel. You see that pirate ship over there? You're going to sail towards it. Blackbeard quickly spotted the boat and fired upon it. He cut the anchor and turned to chase the boat, who turned about face, scurried back to where Lieutenant Maynard and his ship, the Jane, were waiting. At the same time, the other British royal ship, the Ranger, was coming in from the open sea. So both British royal ships are descending upon Blackbeard, who was caught totally unaware. Blackbeard delivered some devastating blows to both ships, completely incapacitating the Ranger. Blackbeard on the Adventure and Maynard on the Jane slowly started floating towards each other. Lieutenant Maynard, anticipating that Blackbeard would board his ship, kept most of his crew locked below deck. As the 2 ships got close to each other, Blackbeard noticed the Jane was mostly empty, so he threw over his grappling hooks and boarded the ship. Blackbeard's crew opened fire on Lieutenant Maynard and his small group of men. Suddenly, the rest of Maynard's men burst from the hold, shouting and firing their guns. Blackbeard was completely caught off guard, but he'd rallied his men and the 2 groups fought each other across the deck, which was said to be already slick with blood. And here we have the notorious Captain Blackbeard in what is likely his first and only mano-a-mano fight. Blackbeard and Maynard fired their guns at each other. Maynard managed to hit Blackbeard, whose shot had missed. They threw their guns down, because, one shot, and drew their cutlasses. Blackbeard broke Maynard's cutlass at the hilt, and he was about to deliver a killing blow, but was slashed across the neck by one of Maynard's men. Knocked back, Blackbeard's cutlass struck Maynard's knuckles instead of killing him. Badly wounded, Blackbeard was descended upon by several of Maynard's crew and killed. It's said that he died by 5 gunshots and 20 stab wounds. The remaining pirates quickly surrendered. Those still aboard the Avenger were captured, including one pirate who had planned to set fire to the powder room and blow up his own ship. Blackbeard's body was parted from his head and thrown into the water. On their return to Virginia, his head was placed on a pole at the entrance to the Chesapeake Bay as a warning to other pirates and a greeting to other ships, and it stood there for several years. The cargo aboard Blackbeard's ship, the Adventure, cotton, indigo, cocoa, and sugar, were sold at auction for what would be worth about $434 $500,000 today. The prize money for capturing Blackbeard would be worth about $100,000. Maynard had to split the prize money with the other officers of the British Royal Navy, which he was not too pleased about, considering he was the only one that actually risked his life. His argument may have garnered sympathy if he hadn't stolen about $23,000 worth of Blackbeard's loot before turning it in. He didn't even get the reward money for another 4 years, and despite his bravery, Maynard was never promoted and faded into obscurity. The remainder of Blackbeard's crew were arrested and taken into Virginia. They were tried for piracy, and all but one was found guilty. They were hanged, and then, dead or not, were strung up in chains and left to rot along Williamsburg Capitol Landing Road, at the time known as Gallows Road. Spooky. Governor Eden, Blackbeard's North Carolina buddy, was highly criticized for his involvement with the pirate and accused of being his accomplice. There were quite a lot of legal shenanigans back and forth about Virginia's right to invade North Carolina and steal their token pirate, but honestly, it kind of bored me, and after having already read the story of Blackbeard, I really didn't have the brain to dive into pirate bribery and backdoor sugar dealings. Official views on pirates were often quite different than those held by contemporary authors, who often described their subjects as despicable rogues of the sea. Privateers who turned to piracy were often considered to be reserve naval forces by the English government, and were sometimes given active encouragement. As I said, royal pardons were regularly issued, especially when England was on the verge of war, and the public's opinion of pirates was often quite favorable. Cheers.